Hi, welcome to this video. I'm talking today about ethanol stoves. Ethanol stoves like the Trangia are basically the most reliable stoves you can have because they are so simple. But because of the fuel, the ethanol, they burn very badly when it's cold. I personally don't use stoves very often for cooking because I normally make a fire, but I need stoves to preheat the oil pan of my car in winter because the car is not starting when it's minus 30 without heating. So first we need to understand what is the problem in winter is ethanol. So basically every stove, the fuel needs to evaporate that it can burn. For example, with a propane stove, the fuel is already gas, so it doesn't need to evaporate anymore. With a gasoline stove, the fuel gets preheated, so it evaporates when it exits the stove. And with ethanol, it's a little bit in between. Ethanol evaporates quite good when it's just exposed to air, but evaporation is highly dependent on the temperature, and there's a problem with the cold comes into the play. When it is minus 25 degrees, ethanol burns really bad. So the standard Trangia stove has a rating in the ideal conditions of about 1 kilowatt hour, 1 kilowatt. Practically, even in summer, you hardly get more than 800 watts heating capacity out of that stove. And when it's minus 25, that stove burns so slowly that you have, I would guess, a maximum of 300 watts, even if I'm unsure. So when you want to cook in the cold and you get that thing burning, it takes very long, but that is not the only problem. The real problem is that while the pot is on the stove, the pot also loses heat again. And the hotter the pot gets, the more heat it loses. So the stove does not only need to heat up the content of the pot, it also needs to compensate for the heat loss. And the higher the heat loss is, the less energy the stove has left for heating up. So if the Trangia has about 300 watts in cold conditions, and the pot is at 80 degrees and you want to boil it, the pot and the surface already perhaps loses 150 watts. So there is only 150 watts left for getting the stuff to boil. And that can basically take endless. This ratio can be so bad that it is even hardly possible to get anything to boil. And everyone who used a propane stove or an ethanol stove practically in winter knows that it somehow feels in the end, shortly before the stuff starts boiling, it's not really getting hotter anymore. And that's a problem. So what you really want to do is you want to get a lot of power, because the more power you have, the shorter you boil and the shorter you need to compensate for the outside cold and the less fuel you need. So besides the difficulty of lighting the Trangia up in the cold or the ethanol stove, it's also a problem that you want to get more power out of it. Yeah. So the Trangia and most other ethanol stoves, they have these small holes here because there is a chamber in the outer ring, and in this chamber there's a sponge, and the sponge sucks the ethanol. So the stove is mainly not burning because of the big opening in the middle. It's mainly burning because the big opening in the middle, the flame from there is heating up this chamber, and it helps evaporating the ethanol also in summer. And then most of the heat of the ethanol actually evaporates out of these holes. And you will see in winter when you try to light it up that basically only the inside burns, because there is not enough stuff evaporating from it. So there are several things you can do. First of all, you can carry the stove and the ethanol at your body. Then it's already warmer. The second thing you can do is to not fill up the stove completely. Because the problem is, if the stove is filled up completely and the flame is on the top, it is not heating up this outer chamber. It is heating the chamber more if the level of the ethanol is lower. Besides that, if there is not so much cold ethanol in it, the ethanol heats up faster. So especially in winter it's good if you don't fill it up so much. We had a very cold night, and it's still pretty cold, so it will not easily work. So now in winter the stove is very, very hard to light. You see, the ethanol is not building up a flame. I can hold my hand here, it's not burning. It's not starting. So the first trick, which is very easy and simple, is you use some toilet paper or some other glove. That actually has the same purpose like the fabric in a candle. It sucks the ethanol and it greatly improves the surface of the ethanol. So even if the ethanol is evaporating slowly because of the greater surface, practically there's more ethanol evaporating. Besides that, the cloth is very easy to ignite. The cloth has a little bit of disadvantage that it's not burning so clean anymore, but it has the advantage that you see the flame better. But we haven't solved the problem yet that the stove has not very much heat outcome. And there's also a trick for that. So you just take the toilet paper again. I extinguish the stove shortly. Check that it's off here. You need some semi-dry surface. You shouldn't do it on the snow, so in the forest you can take some twigs, you can take some wood, you can take a stone where you place the paper on it. Then you place the stove on it. And what we actually do now is we preheat the stove. So we just spill the ethanol on the paper. And even if we need a little bit more ethanol to preheat the stove, for the cooking we need less ethanol because the stove has more power. So first we ignite the stove again, and then we ignite that paper outside. And we have quite a lot of wind today, or not a lot, but we have wind, that's why it's not working so nicely. But if you are at a nice and calm spot, now the paper outside burns and it heats the stove. And actually for that preheating we can already start the cooking, so we don't really lose a lot of the ethanol we spilled around. And as you see already, when I started the stove, there was a lot of ethanol around on the stove, but because of that paper outside, that evaporated completely already. So that paper really makes a difference. And you perhaps also can hear it, how there is quite a lot of flame. It's hard to see on the camera. And now you hear that slight noise. And that noise is actually that now it works, that the gas comes out from the small holes. Because now the paper outside heated the chamber, that ethanol paper, and the ethanol is now evaporating in the chamber so fast that it comes out of these small holes with pressure. And that's what we actually want. There are a lot of variants of these tricks. But the basic idea is always you want the stove and the chamber, the outer chamber of the stove, and the ethanol to get somehow warm or hot. Because then the stove gets power, which you need especially under winter conditions. I hope you liked the video, and I'm really curious about your feedback in the comments. So hey, pa.